Hello, this is Dr. James Strickler, and this lecture is on Chapter 13, The Sectional Crisis, in the United States History textbook, American Yawp. This chapter will deal with the events that led up to the American Civil War. Now, before we can get to the specifics of what happened in the years leading up to the Civil War, we have to remind ourselves of some background that we've learned about in previous chapters. Early in the history of the United States of America, cotton became the predominant crop. This was made possible by the discovery of a new species of cotton called petite Gulf cotton, which could pass more easily through Eli Whitney's invention, the cotton gin, and which grew more denser in the fields. This allowed for higher cotton production. It made it a valuable commodity that could be sold at a reasonable price around the world. As a result, the United States became a cotton economy. The southern states had vast cotton fields in the particular areas and then shipped the cotton to northern mills where it could be turned into fabrics. The northern mills were located in these areas because of something we called the fall line, where water power was easily used to power the mills. By integrating these two parts, north and south in the country, in this one economy, the country became prosperous. But it also became, in important ways, dependent upon the practice of slavery. This process of the cotton economy led to an industrialization in the North, which contributed to Northern advantages in the Civil War that would eventually come. The North became a factory economy, again, still based on cotton, while the South remained an agrarian economy. This would make a big difference as they tried to manufacture the mechanisms of war later on. Though the North did not approve of slavery, and most states were what we would think of as free states where slavery was outlawed, this doesn't mean that they were excited about the idea of having free black people among them. The concern was something called wage suppression. This was the notion among white Northerners that blacks would be willing to work for lower wages. Now, the reason would be that working for low wages is better than the alternative of slavery. By their willingness to work for lower wages, they would drive down the wages of everyone else. So while theoretically white Northerners opposed slavery, they didn't exactly like the idea of a bunch of free blacks being around to compete with them for jobs. Meanwhile, in the South, not only was their economy dependent on cotton production, which relied upon slaves, but also even among white Southerners who were uncomfortable with the idea of having slaves, there was a notion that there was nothing that could be done about it. You can't really free the slaves because that would lead to a race war. They realized that the slave population had already been treated so badly and had accumulated so much anger at what had happened to them that they were an explosion that could happen at any time. So there was this feeling among white Southerners that the slaves had to be oppressed and controlled for their own lives to not be in danger. So we had both people in the North who opposed slavery and people in the South for different reasons who nonetheless went along with its practice, with its continuation in the country for a very long time. But that doesn't mean that everyone was okay with the practice of slavery. There was a growing abolitionist movement in the country. Abolition means the ending of slavery, the abolishment of it. It was led by activists like William Lloyd Garrison, who was the publisher of a paper called The Liberator, which focused on the idea of freeing the slaves. And this movement for abolition was growing within the country. Regardless of the economic and social consequences, abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison thought that there was a moral obligation to end this immoral practice. Abolitionists oftentimes participated in the freeing of slaves, such as through the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a network, a secret organization that would help slaves that escaped from their slavery in the South to eventually make their way to freedom, first of all in the North, and then perhaps even on to Canada, where slavery was forbidden. Now, they might need to go to Canada because, as we've discussed in the past, there were laws in place that would require Northerners to help return Southern slaves if they were found out. These were called fugitive slave laws. And the fugitive slave laws were based upon a clause in the Constitution that we'll talk about in a few moments. These fugitive slave laws made it impossible for Southerners to escape slavery in the South and then just simply move to a free state and then feel like that they were beyond threat of being returned to slavery. There were both incentives for the slaves to be returned and punishments if cooperation was not given to return them. Many northern states, not liking the idea of having these fugitive slave laws, they felt coerced them into helping in the practice of slavery, passed their own personal liberty laws. These were laws that forbade citizens from helping with the slave catchers capture runaway slaves. So you end up having these two sets of laws. The fugitive slave laws passed by the national government and these personal liberty laws passed by the states coming into conflict. That conflict would eventually be resolved by the United States Supreme Court. Now, these controversies over slavery were even more of a problem because the country was continuing to expand westward, such as to settle the lands of the Louisiana Purchase. They would eventually gain more territories from Spain through the Mexican-American War and other things. As the country expanded, the question became what to do with these additional lands regarding the issue of slavery. Would slavery be allowed in these territories and the states that would be eventually built in them, or would it not be allowed? This was a hot political issue of the day. Now, in solving this issue, part of what people would look to is the United States Constitution to see if it would provide any guidance. And in the Constitution, there are several passages that refer to the practice of slavery, though the term slavery is never actually used. In the first part of the Constitution, where it's discussing the composition of the United States Congress, it talks about that the number of representatives in the House of Representatives would be determined by the whole number of free people in a state and 3/5 of other persons. That's a reference to slaves. So when you're counting the number of people in a state, the slaves would be counted differently for purposes of representation. So some people looked at this and said, look, slavery is acknowledged in the Constitution. It's a legitimate founding principle in our country. Other people looked at this and thought that it's an evil practice that was acknowledged in the Constitution, which made the Constitution an unsalvageable evil document itself. This was part of the controversy. Another constitutional passage that refers to slavery, though not directly, is what's oftentimes described as the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution. Here it says that one state cannot, by consequence of its regulations or whatever, stop someone from coming and claiming their property, somebody who's bound to their service or labor, when that person, that slave, has escaped to the other state. Notice, no person held in service or labor escaping may be discharged from their service or labor by just going to another state, but must be delivered up to the party that claims them. There it is, right in the Constitution. This notion that slaves can't escape from slave states to free states and find freedom in that way. A third passage in the Constitution that refers to the practice of slavery was one that dealt with the idea that the new government created under the Constitution would be able to regulate commerce, in other words, trade with other countries around the world. And what this passage did was it prohibited Congress from stopping the slave trade with other countries for 20 years after the Constitution was ratified. Now, this was done to give southern states an opportunity to build up a self-sustaining slave population before the international slave trade was ended. Again, this is another passage that defenders of slavery would refer to as showing that slavery is acknowledged by the Constitution, and critics of the Constitution would refer to as showing that the Constitution was in a sense invalid because of its acknowledgement of the practice of slavery. A final part of the Constitution, which potentially refers to slavery, is found in the Fifth Amendment, which says that the government can't take private property without providing people with compensation for it. Now, where this has to do with slavery is if the government at some point prohibited the practice of slavery, it could be argued that they should have to pay the slave owners in order to do so. With so many slaves valued at such high prices, this would have been a huge undertaking, perhaps so big that there's no way financially that the government of the United States could possibly do it. So while some people proposed the idea of ending this practice of slavery by the government simply buying the slaves from the slave owners and then releasing them, it may not have been a practical possibility to actually do. Now, in addition to those passages in the Constitution, there was one other thing that predated the founding of the United States of America as a single country that is relevant to this question of the status of slavery within the United States. And that was the Northwest Ordinance. This was a law passed under the Articles of Confederation. Now you remember from earlier in this course that after the American Revolution, those 13 original states were each separate little countries. And as separate little countries, they tried to work together in a confederation, governed by a document called the Articles of Confederation. Now, as they tried to work together as a confederation, they could only pass laws if they were unanimous, because they couldn't force each other to obey them as separate little countries. Well, one of the few things that they actually managed to unanimously agree upon was the Northwest Ordinance. This was a law that would govern the settling of the territories that would eventually become known as the Midwest here in the United States of America today. States like Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, places like that. The Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery within those territories, and then by extension, within the states that would eventually be created there. Now, this arguably showed an intent by the original founders of the country not to have slavery spread to other places. So while slavery was acknowledged in the Constitution as a practice that existed, that the southern states depended upon, it could be argued that there was never a plan for it to expand into the other territories. But this mattered. It mattered a lot whether it would expand, because if it did not expand, eventually the southern states would be overwhelmed. There would be many, many more free states than slave states, and they were afraid that they would simply be outvoted and the practice of slavery would be ended that way. Well, despite slavery being prohibited in the Northwest Territories, that doesn't mean that blacks were welcome there, or if they did come, that they were treated equally. An example of this is from the state of Ohio in 1803, where a series of laws called black laws were passed. These black laws did things like prohibit people of African descent from voting or attending school or serving on juries or being in the state militia. Also, if you moved to the state of Ohio and you were black, you would have to go to your local government and register so that they would know that you were there and they could keep an eye on you. Again, this is an example, with many others that we've talked about, of how during this period of American history, while there certainly were places in the country where slavery was viewed as an evil practice not to be done, even those places were also deeply racist by our modern standards. We have come a long way. America is actually today one of the least racist countries in the world. I know there's lots of activism right now and protests about things, but if you compare the attitudes of the United States of America to other countries around the world, like say Japan or Germany or other places, those places are far more racist than America. And America itself was far more racist in the past. Even those areas that were called free areas in the prelude to the Civil War, who actually went to war to keep the Union together and eventually to end slavery, did not have a pure moral record. They were also racist in their own way. So, though whites in any part of the country during this time period um, were generally racist from our modern point of view, there was deep division, though, over whether or not the practice of slavery could continue. Now, that may seem contradictory to us, but it's not necessarily so. Just because some group thinks they're better than another group, which was the case, it doesn't mean, though, that they think that that other group should necessarily be enslaved. So we had two countries, in a sense, bound together. There was one country where slavery was considered an immoral practice that should not take place. That was the northern states. And then there were the southern states where slavery was accepted as a usual part of life. And the question was, as they expanded west and added more states, would those new states be slave or would they be free? How would this change the political balance? Would this eventually lead to the ending of slavery even within the South? Well, this question became of immediate concern when settlers in what would become the state of Missouri applied for statehood. They met the qualifications that had been established by Congress, but there was an even balance between free states and slave states in the United States Senate at this time. And that was a balance that both sides wanted to keep so that neither side could go to any extreme. Well, Missouri would break that balance. And so there was great controversy over whether Missouri would be admitted to the Union as slave or free. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Missouri was admitted as a slave state, but Maine was admitted as a free state at the same time to preserve the balance in the Senate. Then a line was drawn out into the territories along the southern border of Missouri. And the intent was any states that would be admitted to the Union below that line in the future would be admitted as slave states. And the thought was that these states would have warm climates where cotton could be grown and that would be well suited to expanding the practice of slavery there. While states above that line, which would not have climates that would be easily used for raising the kind of crops where slavery was economically useful, would be admitted as free states. This was the Missouri Compromise. And people at the time thought that this would end the controversy, that they could see that slavery sometime in the future could pull the country apart, and they thought they had found a way for the two halves to live together. But obviously they had not. The crisis continued to grow. One of the things that led to the crisis growing was the fact that by this point in American history, the country had what we can describe as universal white male suffrage. And what this means is every white male in the country who was an adult was allowed to vote. Now, this is an important development because early in the history of the United States, you had to meet certain qualifications to vote. Usually they concerned about being a property owner. The idea was that only people who showed a certain responsibility in their life, that they had accumulated enough wealth, enough skill that would allow them to have a trade and earn money and own some land, should be allowed to vote. That other people who hadn't shown their abilities in the same way wouldn't be responsible enough to hold that important power. Well, that had gone away. It had gone away particularly during the political career of Andrew Jackson, as he saw those less prosperous, less educated voters who might not own land as being the kind of people who would best support him. So there was this democratization movement that swept America that eventually led to the idea that every adult white male could vote. Now, what this means then is that you have a great diversity, even within this, what may seem undiverse group of white males, that politicians have to appeal to. Well, whenever you've ever got a diverse group, some rich, some poor, some educated, some not, some living in the north, some living in the south, whatever, that a political group is trying to appeal to, it's going to be very hard. And this led to fractures and divisions within the political parties within the country. On one side, you had the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party had supporters in both the North and the South. And they therefore wanted to avoid the issue of slavery as much as possible. They didn't want to offend either group, but they also were firmly behind the idea of white supremacy. So, as I explained when I talked about the black laws in Ohio, just because white Northerners rejected slavery doesn't mean that they accepted that blacks were their equals. They did not. So, if you were a Democrat, one of these white male Democrats at the time, you probably just didn't want to talk about slavery with other Democrats for fear of avoiding them, but you all agreed that blacks were not the same as you. And you also likely supported westward expansion, bringing new states into the Union. But then that would produce the question, would they be slave or free? Now, why would you support westward expansion? Because you're always trying to find more votes. If you are a mass political party appealing to mass groups, you're always looking for new people to add. So you see some new state out there, I should say some new territory out there being settled, you see those people as potential new voters. This is why, to use a modern comparison, the Democratic Party today wants open immigration. They want people coming in over the southern border from Mexico or Guatemala or whatever, because they see them as future Democratic voters. So, in this past case, they saw added territories to the West as a potential place to increase their power. Now, many of these Democrats didn't just avoid the issue of slavery. They were actually supporters of Southern points of view. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they themselves supported slavery. Again, you could have Northerners who are Democrats who might personally be opposed to slavery, who might say, but you know what, if that's what Southerners want to do, they can do it. These Democrats who were sympathetic to Southern pro-slavery points of view, even though they may have been from the North, were called dough-faced Democrats. That's simply the nickname that was given to them at the time. So, just as you had divisions within the Democratic Party, particularly regarding the issue of slavery, you also had the Whigs that had to deal with similar potential fractures. Now, the way the Whig Party, the other major political party of this time, dealt with this is they tried to be a little bit more cohesive than the Democrats. Now, there's a problem in this. When you're more cohesive, you have more like-minded people together, you may end up being fewer in number. The Whigs, rather than being spread all across the country to the same degree that Democrats were concentrated more in the northern states. They got their start in New England and spread from there. You could find Whigs mostly where New Englanders had moved to settle, in other states or out on the frontier in the territories. The Whigs were supporters of national power. They favored more the federal government being in charge of things, which could be seen as a threat to slaveholders. And they were oftentimes allied with reformers. We've talked previously about reform movements that wanted to end various immoral practices that they saw in the country, including slavery. So the Whigs were much more naturally bent toward anti-slavery, but they also tried to avoid tackling the issue head on. Again, they're trying to win national elections. They want to get enough voters to win. And so even though they might be concentrated in the North and concentrated among people that might seem naturally disposed to oppose slavery, they were not willing to go that far and openly oppose it. As a result of neither major political party being willing to come out and actively oppose slavery, a new political party came into being, the Liberty Party, in 1839, as an explicitly anti-slavery party. But this was too much for many people. Even though it was appealing on a moral level, and there were certainly significant portions of the population that agreed with them, they were just seen as too radical, and they never got traction. They never won anything important. Slavery at this time was best dealt with, most people thought, by simply ignoring it rather than tackling it. An example of them just trying to ignore it can be seen in a rule that was imposed in the House of Representatives for nearly a decade, called the gag rule, which prohibited representatives from speaking on the floor of Congress about the issue of slavery. Notice that they realized how deeply controversial this was. This was because many people who even supported the practice realized the immorality of it. And so they thought it best for the unity of the country and the unity of the political parties to just simply not talk about it. So we continued on with this attempt to just maintain a balance where things wouldn't need to be talked about. So when it came to time to add more states, 2 were added at the same time to maintain the balance between North and South. Michigan and Arkansas added one right after another, so that the careful balance in the United States Senate would not be disturbed. Meanwhile, politics moved on. In the election of 1884, James Polk won, defeating the longtime leader of the Whig Party, Henry Clay. Henry Clay desperately wanted to be president, as you've seen in other chapters, but never managed to do it. One of the reasons was because the Whig Party just simply couldn't appeal to enough people much of the time. James Polk, a relatively unknown Democrat, won because he appealed to people's desire for westward expansion. He was the president of Manifest Destiny that we talked about in a previous chapter. This shows how powerful this idea of moving west was for the country, despite the danger that it brought to the fragile unity of the country because of the controversial issue of slavery. This desire to move west just exacerbated the problem of what to do with those western territories. But again, the balance was attempted to be maintained. So when it came time to add more states, Florida and Iowa, they were added together, 1 slave, 1 free. For decades now, the country's maintaining this delicate balance in the United States Senate, the same number of free and slave states, so that the slave states wouldn't feel threatened. Then this balance was broken with the Texas Revolution against the country of Mexico. The Texas Republic came into existence for a short time, and then it asked to join the United States. Well, how could the United States say no to this opportunity, to this big new chunk of important land becoming part of America? But saying yes then threw off the balance. There were now more slave states than free states. And this really annoyed Northerners from the free states, who thought that they were the ones that held the moral high ground in America. If America was ever going to be all one or the other, of course it would have to be free from their point of view. The idea that slave states would actually hold more power than them in Congress was offensive to them. But nonetheless, that's the position that we found ourselves in as a country when Texas joined. The controversy over slavery was then worsened as northern states' attempt to have some control over what happened with slaves in their territory was ended by the United States Supreme Court decision of Prigg versus Pennsylvania. Now, previously I told you about the conflict between the Fugitive Slave Act and other laws passed by Congress that required northern states to cooperate in the apprehension of runaway slaves, and the personal liberty laws passed by those states, which essentially required citizens to not cooperate in the capture of slaves. Well, that issue was decided by the United States Supreme Court in this case, in which it struck down the personal liberty laws as a violation of the Constitution's Fugitive Slave Clause. Northerners could not protect slaves that had come into their areas from Southern slave catchers coming to get them. This infuriated Northerners. Anti-slavery sentiment in the North was further exacerbated by the publication of Frederick Douglass's autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. I've mentioned Frederick Douglass before. Frederick Douglass was a man who was born into slavery, who eventually, despite there being laws against it and his owners trying to prevent him, learned to read and write. And it turned out that he was quite good at it. He was quite good at public speaking too. He escaped to freedom and became a powerful advocate for the abolition of slavery. As his autobiography was published and read around the country, and he exposed what it was like to actually be a slave, in many places anti-slavery sentiment increased. At the same time, the Underground Railroad continued to operate, stealing away slaves from slavery in the South and secretly bringing them to the North, where they could live in freedom. One of the prominent figures in the Underground Railroad was a woman named Harriet Tubman. She's one of the remarkable figures in American history this time. She would go repeatedly to the South on dangerous missions to round up slaves and escort them to freedom in the North. It was during this time period that the Mexican-American War was fought, that we've talked about in previous chapters as we talked about Manifest Destiny and the expansion of the United States of America. The Mexican-American War began to be fought over a dispute over where the southern border of Texas was. Well, by the end of the war, when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, Mexico had to give over a giant chunk of its territory to the United States of America to end the war. That territory would eventually become the states of California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and even Wyoming. Now the question then became what to do in these newly won territories. Would they be free territories or would they be slave territories? And again, Congress tried to, as best they could, avoid the question. A man named David Wilmot proposed a law in Congress called the Wilmot Proviso, which would have banned slavery in these new territories acquired by Mexico. But it was defeated in the United States Senate. Remember, there are more senators from slave states in the Senate than there are from free states. And they wanted to maintain the possibility of slavery spreading to these western territories so they could maintain that balance and not ever have Congress outlaw slavery. Well, many people in the country who were anti-slavery couldn't stand this idea that Southerners could always have a veto over things that were designed to end the practice of slavery. And so they formed a new political party called the Free Soil Party, where they tried to gather in various anti-slavery movements into a single party. They tried to get anti-slavery Whigs and anti-slavery Democrats to come together. Now, the Free Soil Party never had huge success, but it did have some minor success. In the election of 1848, they actually managed to elect one person to the United States Senate from Ohio. But more importantly, in the House of Representatives, though they were few in number, because the Democrats and the Whigs were so close in numbers, the Free Soil Party held the balance in Congress. In other words, you couldn't get anything done. The Democrats couldn't have a majority, the Whigs couldn't have a majority, unless the Free Soil Party went along with one or another. Well, that anti-slavery sentiment in Congress was sufficient that eventually Wisconsin was admitted as a free state. This was done to balance out against Texas, to again restore balance to the United States Senate. As you can see throughout this time period, they're just trying to avoid really grappling with the idea of slavery. They're just trying to avoid it. They're trying to maintain the status quo. Well, in the election of 1848, the Whigs finally win the presidency. Zachery Taylor, a hero from the Mexican-American War, the general who was involved in the initial provocation to cause the Mexican-American War, was elected as a war hero. The Whigs finally had power, they thought, to try to change some things. But Zachery Taylor didn't serve long as president and didn't get much done. He eventually died of some sort of stomach ailment. We're not sure what it was. But he had extreme abdominal pains, and after a couple of days he died. And a man named Millard Fillmore took over as President of the United States. And neither Zachery Taylor nor Millard Fillmore did anything particularly important as president. They just lacked the time and power to do it. Now, one more complication to this is the religious group, commonly known as Mormons, members of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, who we've previously mentioned in this course, had moved to what would eventually become the state of Utah to find sanctuary from the persecutions that they had experienced in New York, Ohio, Missouri, and eventually in Illinois. They decided to go beyond the boundaries of the United States to avoid those things, and they settled in what was Mexican territory in Utah. Now, this was mostly empty land, and the Mormons soon became a powerful population there. And they even proposed the possibility of creating their own country there, the state of Deseret, which would eventually apply for equal admission in the United States the way Texas had. Their notion was that if they completely controlled a state, particularly a big, powerful state like this, that they might finally be treated the way that they wanted to be treated. So you have this group on the frontier who's trying to protect themselves, who ends up appearing to some people in the United States as a rogue threat. Meanwhile, in Congress, they are trying to figure out what to do with this boiling problem of slavery still. And we get in 1850 a new compromise. On one side, you have Henry Clay, the famous Whig, who, as I said a few moments ago, ran for president several times and never won. And on the other side, you have Stephen A. Douglas. He was sometimes referred as the Little Giant. He was a very small man, but he was a very powerful person in the United States Senate from the state of Illinois. He was a Democrat. And they worked out a compromise about what to do concerning slavery in these newly admitted territories in the West. The first part of this compromise, which they managed to push through Congress, was that California would be admitted as a free state. The second part is that the borders of Texas would finally be settled. Lands that had been claimed by Texas would be ceded to the states of Wyoming, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. This is how we got the border of Texas today. Meanwhile, New Mexico and Utah would be organized into their own territories, and they would be allowed to determine for themselves whether or not slavery would exist in them. Now, the reason the Southerners were willing to go along with this is they still imagined the possibility that slavery would move into the New Mexico territories, that what other states were eventually created from them would be slave states. As part of the compromise, the anti-slavery forces got slavery banned in Washington, D.C. I should say the slave trade banned. There were still slaves there, but you could do no more buying and selling of slaves in Washington, D.C. Now, in some ways, this is kind of a hollow victory in that somebody could still buy a slave elsewhere and take them into Washington, D.C. But it was an important symbolic victory because Washington, D.C. is not part of any state. It is an area maintained by the federal government. And here you have the federal government banning the trade of slaves within an area controlled by it. This is a very symbolic gesture about how the federal government feels about slavery. Yet, at the same time, the Fugitive Slave Act was strengthened. Now, Southern slave catchers could come into northern states and they could deputize citizens to help them capture runaway slaves. They would go to the local police authority, demand that they assist them as was required, and if they said we don't have enough manpower, well then deputize some people to assist us. We know the slave's around here somewhere, you've got to help us catch him. Northerners again hated this idea that they would be forced to contribute to the practice of slavery. But this was part of the compromise. So the compromise of 1850 gave a little bit to both sides. But one of the features of it that showed most where its sentiments were really tilting was that there was a series of federal commissioners that were set up to oversee the capture of runaway slaves. So the way things worked is that a slave catcher would come to the north, they would capture someone who they insisted was a runaway slave, and then they would have to appear before some government official and offer some sort of proof that this was a runaway slave, that they weren't just capturing some free person. Well, this was done by local courts, and oftentimes the local courts were biased, and particularly a free state, a judge who might be anti-slavery might then rule in favor of the runaway slave and let them go, even though they really were a runaway slave. Southerners hated this. So what the Compromise of 1850 did was it set up these federal commissioners who would decide these cases instead. But here's the interesting kicker. If they concluded at the end of the case that the party brought before them was in fact a slave to be returned to the South, they would be paid $10 for adjudicating that case. If, on the other hand, they determined that the person was a free person, they would only be paid $5 for adjudicating the case. So you can see there's a financial incentive for them to, as often as possible, rule that the captured individuals are in fact slaves that need to be taken back to the South. So as this Compromise of 1850 is taking effect and giving both Northerners and Southerners, both those who are against slavery and those who are in favor of slavery, reasons to be irritated with the other's behavior, we have a novel published by an author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which paints a very unflattering picture of what slavery was like in the South. And this novel becomes a sensation. It becomes the best-selling book in the country other than the Bible. Everyone reads it, and they hear these horrible descriptions of what slaveholders are like. And this turns many other people who might have been trying to avoid the issue into supporters of ending slavery. We then move on to the election of 1852. Again, the Whigs try to nominate a war hero, Winfield Scott. He was the man who had actually captured Mexico City during the Mexican-American War. But it doesn't work this time. Instead, he is crushed by Franklin Pierce, a relative nobody who was chosen by the Democrats at their national convention on the 49th ballot of them trying to pick a presidential candidate. This was really the end of the Whigs as a national party. They simply couldn't gather enough votes in to be viable anymore. The next issue that came up in trying to determine the future of slavery in America concerned what to do about the territory that would become known as Nebraska. There were enough settlers moving in there from places like Missouri and Arkansas and Iowa and elsewhere that those parts of the country that were territories would soon be applying for statehood. And the question is what to do about them. The solution was offered by Stephen A. Douglas, the little giant of the Senate. It was called the KansasNebraska Act, and it was based on an idea called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the notion that government derives its power from the people. So the people should decide what power the government does or does not have. And in this case, the people of the territory would decide whether the government of the state that they were forming could ban slavery or not ban slavery. Now, this seems like a reasonable solution to this controversial situation. At least it seemed reasonable at the time. Let the people decide whether they want slavery in that territory or not. But it just made things worse. This crisis that had been boiling for decades now explodes. A well-known event that happened, which showed just deeply how problematic this division was, concerned the arrest of a man named Anthony Burns in Boston, Massachusetts. Anthony Burns was a runaway slave who in Boston had become a preacher in a black church there. Well, eventually it was discovered that he was a runaway slave, and he was arrested by slave catchers. Well, as they tried to escort him across town to ship him back to the South, anti-slavery mobs assaulted. They assaulted the jail that he was being held in initially. Well, what happened was, to resolve it, was federal troops were called in to escort him through the city to ship him back to the South, to keep the mob at bay. It cost about $40,000. Now, you got to remember, money was worth a lot more back then. It cost about $40,000 to provide all those troops to escort him through the city to send him back to slavery. Well, once he got there, some anti-slavery people went to his master who had retrieved him and bought his freedom for $1,300. So now think about this. You have the federal government spending $40,000 to keep a man in slavery whose slavery was only worth $1,300. Now, if you're a northerner, an anti-slavery person, you say this is crazy. How could the government be spending more money to maintain this evil practice than the practice itself is worth? So this continues to divide the country worse and worse. In the United States Congress, an incident then happens where blood is actually spilled. A senator from South Carolina gave a speech, a man named Andrew Butler, in which he accused another senator, Charles Sumner, or excuse me, I have it backwards, forgive me. Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts gave a speech accusing a senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler, of having slaves only so that he could rape the slave women. Now, that's really the kind of thing that he implied in his speech. Now, this so incensed some people that Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, ended up being attacked. A representative, Preston Brooks from South Carolina, a cousin of the senator who had been insulted, went into the Senate chamber where Charles Sumner was, pulled out his cane, and beat him nearly to death with it. Preston Brooks was not arrested for this. He was not even censored by the House of Representatives. He was not kicked out of the House of Representatives. He ended up resigning instead, went back home to South Carolina, where he was overwhelmingly reelected. In the years that followed, he would receive canes shipped to him from admirers that had inscribed upon them, "Hit him again." This showed how people felt about this. First, Charles Sumner felt that he could be deeply individually insulting as he tried to oppose that practice of slavery. And Preston Brooks thought he could be violent as he defended the honor of those who practiced slavery. It's showing how emotionally deep this division was becoming in the country. This division came to a nasty head in Kansas, so much so that it became known as Bleeding Kansas. Now remember, the issue of slavery would be decided in the territory of Kansas, as it became the state of Kansas, by popular sovereignty. They would have a vote. They would choose a legislature, and then the legislature would meet together and they would either outlaw slavery or they wouldn't. So it really mattered who was winning that vote. Were pro-slavery or anti-slavery candidates winning? Well, As the election was held, there was a lot of fraud and violence that took place. People streamed in from other states, both free and slave, to vote. And there was assault and intimidation at the polling places. An example of people trying to manipulate the vote in Kansas can be seen in the New England Immigrant Aid Company. This was an organization that was created to pay anti-slavery New Englanders to move to Kansas so that they could become residents and vote anti-slavery in Kansas. So you had people thinking about this vote in Kansas as not just about what people in Kansas would decide, but it was becoming a proxy for the divisions in the country as a whole. Well, when the vote was held, it appeared that the opponents of slavery had won the day. But the federal government refused to recognize that vote, claiming that it had been obtained by fraud. So what happened was the anti-slavery people organized their own legislature and passed a new Kansas Constitution on their own. Now, that seems illegitimate too. So you have both sides claiming victory in Kansas, and in some cases going to open war over it, shooting and killing each other. In the midst of these vicious conflicts over slavery in the country, a new political party is founded out of the ashes of the Whig Party, which had fallen apart. This is called the Republican Party. It was founded as an explicitly anti-slavery party, and it held its first convention in Philadelphia. In that first convention, it nominated a man named John C. Fremont to be its candidate for president. Now, Fremont is the same guy you may remember in a previous chapter who assumed first control of the Republic of Texas on behalf of the United States of America during the Mexican-American War. He was kind of a mythical, rough character from the frontier. Well, despite being a political newcomer, despite this being a new political party, they actually won the presidential vote in 11 of the 16 free states. Now, this didn't win them the election. Instead, James Buchanan, the Democrat, won. But even this level of achievement shocked many pro-slavery people. They thought, man, there's no way that this crazy new anti-slavery party is going to win anything. And then they won 11 out of the 16 free states. So with those sort of political changes happening, the pro-slavery South is getting nervous about what direction the country is going politically. But at the same time, something happens to scare the anti-slavery North. It's a United States Supreme Court's decision in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. The man named Dred Scott had been a slave. And then what had happened is his master had taken him freely to a northern territory to live where slavery was illegal. He was then brought back to the South, and at that point, well, actually it was some years later, but I don't want to go into the complications of the story, Dred Scott claimed he was a free man because he had been not escaped to the North, but brought there freely by his master to a place where slavery was illegal. And if slavery is illegal there, and his master freely brought him there, then he couldn't be a slave anymore. It'd be like if you, say, bought marijuana in Colorado where it's legal, and then you got in a plane and flew back to, say, Georgia where it's illegal. You couldn't then claim at the airport as they're trying to confiscate your marijuana, no, that belongs to me because I bought it in a legal place. No, they would say, no, it's illegal here, you can't have it. Well, Dred Scott made the same argument, that yes, he was a slave in Missouri, but when his master brought him to the free territory, his master in effect freed him. Well, his case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court ruled against Dred Scott. They said that a black person could never be a citizen of the United States, and thus he could never bring his lawsuit in court either. They also ruled that slavery could not be outlawed in that way in the territories, that somebody could bring their slaves where they wanted. This was seen in some ways as a victory for the South. The Supreme Court had essentially said, take your slaves anywhere you want in the territories and it can't be outlawed. The Supreme Court justice who wrote the opinion left the court that day and thought that he had saved the country from civil war by reducing the fears of the Southerners that their slaves would not be a possession that they could keep. But all he ended up doing was angering the Northerners more. But as this slavery controversy is brewing, the President of the United States at the time, James Buchanan, is viewed as not dealing with it seriously. Instead, he's getting nervous about the Mormons in Utah, and he sends federal troops in to supposedly put down a rebellion there that didn't actually exist. Now, there were a couple little skirmishes between the Mormons and the soldiers, very minor things, instigated as much by the soldiers as by the Mormons. But most people in the country saw this as just a diversion, an unnecessary use of force against a people that weren't really a problem. This weakened Buchanan's position. It was seen as a blunder that he should not have gotten involved in. Meanwhile, the United States Congress, now with California providing a free majority in the United States Senate, admits two other anti-slavery states, Minnesota and Oregon. Now the balance between North and South in the Senate is completely lost. The North clearly has a majority in both houses of Congress, and Southerners are getting more and more worried. In the election of 1858, an unknown politician in Illinois named Abraham Lincoln runs for Senate as a Republican. He's running against Stephen Douglas, the little giant from the Senate that I've talked about before, who was a Democrat. Famously, they engage in a series of long debates as they travel around the state. And those long debates make Lincoln famous. Those debates essentially become a debate over the future of slavery in the country. Now, while Douglas in the end wins the election and is returned to the Senate, Lincoln becomes a national figure by this attempt that he made to defeat Douglas. Back in Bleeding, Kansas, one of the prominent figures fighting for the anti-slavery side against the pro-slavery side was a self-made minister named John Brown. He and his family were notorious for going around and killing pro-slavery people that had moved into the state. He believed that he had been called on a mission from God to end slavery in the United States of America. He's become a mythical figure since then. What you see depicted on the slide is a mural in the state capitol in Kansas, depicting John Brown as a heroic figure, while some people view him as just a cold-blooded murderer. Well, the most famous thing that John Brown did was he tried to organize a slave revolt. He went east and it ended up going to a military armory in the town of Harper's Ferry in what is now West Virginia. He tried to capture the armory, to get the weapons inside, to distribute to slave populations so that they then could go to war with their masters. He was hoping to start a slave rebellion that would lead to the end of slavery in America. He thought God had called him to do this. Well, he ended up being caught in the act. Troops from the U.S. Army came in. He was captured. His sons were killed. And eventually he was put on trial and convicted. Interestingly, the soldier of the United States Army who came in and stopped him from capturing Harper's Ferry and distributing the guns to slaves was Robert E. Lee, who would eventually become the general over the Confederate armies in the American Civil War. Well, John Brown's trial became in some ways a trial for slavery. People became less concerned about what John Brown had actually done and more concerned about his symbolism in the cause. For those who were against slavery, he was viewed as a martyr a person who had been standing up for what was right. And eventually, when he was convicted and hanged, they believed that he was hanged for doing the morally right thing, while others viewed him as a terrorist who was willing to engage in crime and even murder in pursuit of his political objectives. Well, when he was eventually executed by hanging, and people all over the anti-slavery North mourned his death, Southerners were rocked to their core. They saw this man as a cold-blooded murderer who had tried to create an insurrection against the United States of America, and he was being held up as a hero. How could that happen? That could only happen if the North viewed slavery as such a moral evil that even a murderer like John Brown would be forgiven if he was against it. That let the South know that the North would never tolerate slavery in the long run, and caused them to fear that if they didn't do something radical, they would lose their way of life, which was based on slavery. And that does it for this chapter 13.